That's
Yeah,
good.
that's great.
That's
That's great,
definitely,
John.
yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Um, okay, so a little bit of a heads up, the basic sort of structure of the qualification. As I said, 120 guided learning hours, around about 40 hours recommended for teaching. That's not mandatory. That's a matter of your own sense of what your learners need, but it gives you an idea of the size of the qualification in terms of the learner expectations and the demand that the demand on them as they develop their work. So as I'm sure you're also aware, the qualification is structured into 4 units: the dissertation, investigation, performance and artifact, and learners will only work within one of those 4. It's worth saying as well, and you'll appreciate this, I'm sure, if you've had familiarity with the teaching of the course, that it is designed to develop independent learning. I mean, EPQ was conceived nearly 20 years ago now as an autonomous piece of work where the learner really does take charge and takes responsibility for the management of their projects. And you'll see within our marking grids that we reward, in particular in AO1, we reward those learners who can really take charge of the process, whilst also recognizing, of course, that this is independence is something they achieve through the project. It's not necessarily something that's innate from the outset. So they're going to be working with advice, support, guidance from the teacher assessor throughout the process. And the role of the mentor in guiding that journey is really important. In terms of the inspiration as well to start the project, I often find myself saying to students that their own commitment and their own interest and their own passion and curiosity is what will drive the project forward. So it really is the case, perhaps almost uniquely with EPQ, that they have a degree of freedom to choose whatever they want to do within the framework of our assessment objectives. And so the key is to find something that's a motivation, a drive, an interest that's going to sustain them through that long haul of the 80 hours or so that they'll be spending with their project. So whether it's their hobbies, their interests, their goals for the future, or a question or topic that's come up in another course that they're studying, which they just want to go into much more depth, there does just need to be that driving passion that underpins their project. And it's worth spending time at the outset of the course, giving them encouragement to actually dream and think wide and hard about the range of interests that they have and what they can really bring into their EPQ. So that's just a little bit of talk about the outset and the initial phase of the project. In terms of the actual structure of the process, as you probably be aware, there are essentially 4 main elements that all learners will produce: a project proposal form, an activity log, the main outcome of the project, whether that's a report, slides, sketchbook, video content. There needs to be a record of the actual major work that's been done in the project and a presentation which they give at the end to an audience, which should include their teacher assessor and possibly others as well. All the documentation is available on the website for those. I mentioned the 4 units. In brief, the dissertation takes the form of a personal response to a question, typically investigated using other people's published research. So secondary rather than primary research tends to dominate in the dissertation unit. I mentioned as well there that it's an open question. It's important that the learners choose a question where there's scope for argument and counter-argument rather than a simple descriptive or narrative response. Investigation or field studies are for learners who want to do primary research, either by collecting their own data and doing analysis, or by curating sources of data that others have produced and beginning to ask new questions and look for new patterns and trends within them. So we're looking here at a very standard scientific or geography-based field study, something where you can test a hypothesis using data and do a pretty rigorous job with some numbers and some graphs and some statistics to bring to bear on that. Performance work, as Helen will explain to us, is a personal response again, but perhaps not so much a response to a question as a response to a commission, work which has been crafted for a particular audience to meet a particular need or a particular request. So Helen, you're off mic, but I'm sure you're going to say this much more eloquently than I can. What would you want to add anything on
I
that
think
in terms of what?
only very briefly, I suppose, for the equivalence of the answer to that question of dissertation and the equivalence of that argument of the dissertation is really thinking of what the purpose is of your performance. So what effect you want on a particular target audience, whether you're kind of shocking, entertaining, raising awareness, etc. And then wrapped in carefully chosen stylistic qualities. So you understand the influences and how they will help have that effect or that purpose.
Super, thank you. And similarly, our cognate unit, the artifact, where we again emphasize that it doesn't necessarily have to be a question, but there does need to be a focus to the work. This is a secondary school, typically a secondary aged project. It's probably not like the project they did aged 5 or 6 at primary school when they looked at the Egyptians or the Vikings or the Romans. There needs to be more focus to it. And in the case of Artifact, as Rachel, if you're happy to come on mic and explain, this is often framed through a design brief. Do you want to elaborate, Rachel, on that?
Absolutely, I can elaborate. So that's a design brief that might well drill down and become a detailed specification that makes reference to specifics. And in specifics, we're talking about the user or the client group. It could be the style or genre if it's an art-based outcome. It could be and just the type of product, but as many specifics as you can get in there. And I think I could just pick up a question that's come in the chat at the moment, which refers to briefs. And it's just saying, does the working title almost have to be the end product? And I suppose the answer to that is quite often you will find that that brief becomes refined as the process and the exploration continues. So absolutely, that brief can become more refined as they go through the process.
Yeah, that's a really good question and a helpful point. Thanks, Rachel. And just to add in more general terms on that, if as what often does happen, and in a sense we want to encourage, learners do refine and adjust their brief. One of the things, or their plans for any of the units, one of the things which we encourage is that they refine and update their proposal form so that the final version of the proposal form reflects the actual title of the project as it is at its completion, rather than perhaps the one they started with. So if they do update, please do encourage them to update their proposal. The proposal form is a document that can be changed and modified as the project unfolds. And of course, they can then keep records in their activity log of some of those changes to show their ongoing refinement and development. We're really focused though today on assessment. So let's begin to turn our minds towards that. Assessment objectives, we have 4: the project management, which is marked out of 9, the use of resources, marked out of 12, development and realization, marked out of 24, and review, marked out of 9. So for those of you whose mental arithmetic is working at this time of the day, that's a total of 54 marks. And for those with really outstanding mental arithmetic, you might have worked out that that's 44% of the marks for development and realization. So that's the big one, AO3, where they actually respond to whatever question or challenge or brief or commission they've set themselves. Their personal response and the journey of discovery and inquiry and critical reflection that powers it, that's really at the heart of a good project. That said, of course, you can only really respond in an intelligent and informed fashion if you've done your research. And so AO2, 22% of the marks, 12 out of 54, it's not quite as weighty in terms of numbers, but it's very, very significant as the foundation of a successful project. And we can't short circuit that part of the process. The research is the foundation for everything else in the project. An AO4 review we'll come back to, typically evidenced through the final presentation, but also usually through a written evaluation of the process, which can be included in their report or sketchbook or slides. We do want to see evidence of how marks are awarded, but we don't want you to get spill too much ink on the page unnecessarily. So typically a project should have commentary on the candidate record sheet, and it's very helpful to us if that commentary reflects the language used in the marking grids to really show us what you think the mark band position should be and why. It's useful to include a few annotations or digital comments now on the side of a project, just so we're confident that the work has been thoroughly inspected. But the primary source of evidence should be on the candidate mark record sheet. There's also an oral presentation mark record sheet that should accompany the final presentation. And also for projects which involve an event, which may be observed by an external third-party observer. For example, if they've gone and done some work experience as part of their project, or in the case of doing a performance, we'd expect there to be a witness statement which can provide extra corroboration of what happened and how it met some of the assessment objectives. The witness statement does not itself need to be filled in by the main teacher assessor, so it's supporting evidence for the teacher assessor's final judgment. In terms of what the learners themselves produce, a typical project is going to have some planning, which could be mainly in the project proposal form. It's quite common now for some learners to submit other forms of planning evidence, such as mind maps or Gantt charts. If they're writing a dissertation, some of their thinking about it could be present in the introduction to the project. There will then be some records of research that can, in the case of an investigation or dissertation project, be in the form of a literature review. If it's creative work in the performance and artifact unit, then that's likely to be things like a study of influences, a study of genre, research into the relevant materials and processes, techniques and design ideas. And that could be visual, it could be creative, it could be partly documentary, it could involve video evidence as well. Evidence that they've thoroughly investigated the relevant genre that underpins their choice of project. Then there'll be some development of a response. Again, in a written project, that would typically be an academic discussion of arguments for and against on their chosen question. In the case of an investigation, that will take the form of data analysis, really drilling into the data and looking for the trends and patterns. And if it's creative work in the performance and artifact units, then we'd expect to see a journey of development of their own ideas informed by the material that they've researched, but in which they begin to find their own voice and express their own ideas and test them out as well. I mean, the best projects don't simply go from conception to final product. There's a journey through the woods where they can go off in lots of different directions and try out a few alternative pathways, looking for the best route to create their own response to their initial objectives. And as I mentioned, the final part of every project should be some reflective review, which is typically done through the presentation plus an evaluation. Just in terms of mechanics, once the projects are finished, there will be a teacher assessor who's been supervising who should mark the work. Assuming that more than one teacher assessor is involved, there should be some internal standardization that goes on. We, as in the awarding organization, don't mandate how that's done. I'm sure you're familiar with the possible models, whether that's having one teacher who samples from all the assessors who've been involved, or whether it involves exchange of exemplars and meetings to agree a common standard. The choice of process of how the process is done is yours, but it is really important that that process is followed, please. It's very important that the sample of work, which is then sent for external moderation, does show clearly a sense of a shared common understanding internal to that centre. Typically, when the sample request comes through to you, which will be by January the 10th for the Winter Award Series, or by May the 15th for the Summer Award Series, typically you'll be requested to produce a sample of 10 projects. Although if you're a very large centre, that may be somewhat larger than that. And if you're a very small centre, it might be less. But typically the sample request will be 10. And that should include the top and bottom mark project. It's very important, please, that even if they were not initially requested, you do send in the top and bottom marked piece, because that completes the range for us when we're doing the external moderation. Okay, so at this point, in a moment, we're going to start looking through the marking grids. But before we do that, if I can push a few buttons, I'm going to just stop my screen share. You might like to just take a note before I come off this slide of where to find the marking grids. I've already shared the hyperlink to the spec in the chat thread. So the marking grids that we're going to look at on page 15 to 30 for dissertation, 28 to 33 for investigation, 41 to 46 for performance, and 53 to 57 for the artifact. So with that in mind, let's just pause and see. Helen and Rachel, you've been kindly monitoring the chat thread. Is there anything that's popped up that we need to discuss that still remains as an outstanding question?
Not from the questions that have come directly to me as such. I have just popped in there for everybody that to follow on from John's point on sampling, that if you have entries for more than one of the units, it will be a sample for each of those you have entries for, rather than across all 4 of them. So if you have artifacts and dissertations, you would need a sample for dissertation and a sample for artifact. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks for that, Helen. I'm just checking now that I can see my screen again. I gather it looks like there might still be someone in the waiting room. So if our host for today, who's managing all the room, is happy to just thanks, that's great, because I'm yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. Super. Okay. Well, we're doing well for time. So before we go to the marking grids, if anyone does want to type in a question into the chat thread at this point, I'll just pause for a moment before we move on. So any further questions you want to ask, do please type them in now. We're doing that rather than asking you to come on mic, because it's quite a large meeting, and a recording of this is going to be available afterwards. So it's probably simplest and easiest for the process if we do this through the chat thread. So if you're happy to put any questions in there, please do. And as I say, that can happen at any time in the session, but now is a designated Q&A moment. So please do pop any questions in, and then once we've so a centre with, we have a question, a small centre, 3 students in the group, all the different projects. So if you've got fewer than 10 in your centre, then when the request comes through, all of them will be requested. Okay, so you'll send them all.
And is it worth just adding to that question as a response, the different projects is okay if they're within a unit, but it's the different units that trigger the separate samples. So you may have 3 artifacts which are different types of artifact, that would still be the 1 artifact sample. But if you've got dissertations or investigations or performances or artifacts, those are the 4 kind of headings under which you may have a discrete sample, but that will be linked to what unit you've entered the learner for.
Yeah. Yes, so the best, we want to all the way through, we need to be thinking about the 4 separate units almost as separate qualifications. I mean, they run they have their own assessment teams, and you'll get a sample request for each one if you've entered in multiple units. So the question about a more user-friendly version of the marking grids. Yeah, we've got one. Sorry about that. It is something we can easily make available. So I'll actually be using one of those in this session, so we can find somewhere to put that on the website, I'm sure. Although I may have misunderstood that question, in an editable format. That's interesting. Yes, I'm not so sure we've got, it may be that we're confusing here the mark record sheet with the actual marking grid. I've been referring to the marking grid meaning the set of criteria. That I think isn't something you would necessarily need to edit, but we can check as well that there is an editable version of the mark record sheet in Word format. Examples of performance, yes, yeah, the examples of performance are coming up. Yeah. So a question about artifact evidence. Photos are exactly right now. Everything that's submitted has to be submitted in digital form now. All the work that you will submit for moderation will go through the Learner Work platform. And so we typically suggest that photographs of a sketchbook are included, or a slideshow can be submitted as a PDF document, for example. So it's not the artifact itself that gets submitted. And it's also worth encouraging learners to think about evidence and the selection of evidence. You know, they don't have to show us everything they've done. They can be judicious in selecting the key moments in the project so that they end up with a portfolio that's not necessarily hundreds of pages for somebody to scan and upload. how many drafts should students be allowed to submit? One. Okay, if that means to the exam board, to us, we just take the final piece of work. Within centre, that's really going to be a question for you to consider, how you actually go through the marking and monitoring process. There's a little bit of guidance in the spec on that. And we do encourage mentors, obviously, to be closely involved throughout the process, supporting learners, but we're also fully aware that it's an independent project. It probably wouldn't be appropriate, I think, for example, for a detailed mark to be given based on the full breakdown of the marks, and then for students to be redrafting following the mark being already effectively awarded. So I think you need to effectively have a look at the guidance for mentors in the specification. There's also some general guidance on the JCQ website about good conduct with coursework qualifications, and I think that gives us our right steer and a helpful framework. A cooking project with a student creating a menu for tasting sounds appealing. Lovely. Okay. We've got a few more questions coming in, which I'll deal with now, and then we're going to move into looking at the grids. Yeah. So I see now somebody is requesting a more clear single-page version or accessible bank of comments. Right, that's a good question. We'll have a look at that and think about whether or not we could do something to make that more easily accessible. Okay, splendid. We've got a pause on the immediate flow of questions. So at that point, I'm going to take my life in my hands, press some more buttons, and see if I can bring up some marking grids for us to inspect. So as time is reasonably tight, I'm not going to spend the entire session going through all the minutiae, but I'm just going to highlight a few, as it were, key themes from the marking grids. So I'm hoping now that the P301 grid will appear and is in a reasonable size to read. Is that right?
We've gone back to the kind of view we were on earlier, with the other pages down the side. But I think,
okay. Is it large enough to read? That's because I could probably enlarge. I might be able to
just zoom in. Oh, that's if it just maybe zooms in slightly, it's a little better.
Yeah. Let me see if I can do that.
John, just before you kind of launch with the wonderful world of the criteria, there is quite an interesting question which may be of interest to others, just around clarity in terms of if somebody's already studying a particular subject, say as part of their year 12 just curriculum kind of subject choices, can that be used in terms of subject area for them to extend with the APQ? And I think that just what draws a line of duplication rather than extension may be helpful to answer that particular one, if that's something.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. The answer is that a project can, as its name suggests, be an extension from existing knowledge or indeed from a topic that's been studied in another area. But there's a kind of a hard and fast rule in terms of actual content that's produced within the project, and the hard and fast rule is that the material that's submitted shouldn't be work that's been used for another assessment elsewhere. So if they've done some coursework, then yes, that wouldn't be something that could be submitted in the APQ. But it may well be the case that they've learned about, I don't know, a topic within history, it stimulated their interest, and they then wish to pursue it in greater depth, perhaps to look for more sources and gain a deeper understanding. Or it may be that there are topics from two of their subjects of study and they want to bring them together in a cross-disciplinary way. Or they may want to take a topic they've learned about and express their ideas in a new medium, perhaps turn it into something performative or a creative artifact response. So by all means, the knowledge that they've acquired in their studies is one of the resources that they can draw on, as long as the project involves a significant extension into a new area or a new acquisition of skills. So yes, that's short of actually, the one thing we obviously can't do is literally reproduce the same material, but knowledge and ideas are a resource that can be used as a basis, even if they've been acquired in another subject setting. Right, I hope I've pressed the right button and we have a visible marking grid. Is it legible on screen? It's legible. Okay. Is it intelligible on screen? Well, let's see. The marking grid for the dissertation, as all of the marking grids, has the structure of the 4 objectives. And as I say, I'm not going to highlight everything, but I am going to just try and draw a few points from the top band, really, just because, not because I'm assuming all our learners will land there, but because it is the most full in terms of the actual amount of detail of where we're aiming to get to. So you'll see that one of the key features is that, and this is true of all the units, we expect there to be a significant refinement of objectives and titles. And in the best cases, that should be something which happens with a degree of independence. So, you know, your top band learner will characteristically beginning to ask their own questions, think for themselves, develop their own interpretations and ideas, and use those to really shape and hone the title. That's not to imply that it has to be done completely without any conversational support. But the point is that in your conversations with that learner, that you'll get the sense that they're beginning to define it for themselves, rather than you having to suggest possible avenues all the time. There's some planning. There's documents, section 3 on the planning document that should be filled in a reasonable amount of detail. We have an exemplar of that on the website, which is probably the most useful way for learners to understand what's expected there. The other element in AO1 is the activity record, the activity log. And the key to a good activity log is ongoing reflection. So it's in some ways a poorly named document because it's not really about activities. It's much more about ideas and thoughts and feelings and decisions and problems and solutions, all the internal conversation that might go on that doesn't get shown on the page. So the activity log should really be, as much as anything, a journey of ideas and reflections. And that's true whatever the unit is. 301 isn't unique in that respect. I'll just ask our host for the event if you could kindly admit we have another person, it looks like from my screen, who's appeared in the waiting room. So if you could just admit that other delegate at this point, that would be appreciated. We also have in AO2 an emphasis on research. And really the key to research is, first of all, as you'll see, indexing it in terms of the range of sources that are examined, the quality of referencing. So a top band AO2 in a dissertation unit would have a substantial bibliography with a good range of sources, not just the top sources that come off a search when they've typed their question into a search engine, but evidence that they've really investigated a bit more deeply. Analysis matters. It's not just a matter of paraphrasing information. It's a matter of thinking through its meaning, interpreting it, expressing its connections to other sources, and expressing its connections to the question that's been selected. It also matters that learners evaluate sources. Questions like who published it, who wrote it. These are really valuable questions for them to be reflecting on as they use their sources in a critical and evaluative way. In the dissertation unit, that can happen quite naturally in footnotes or endnotes, so that it doesn't interfere with the flow of the text, although there are different ways in which it can work. The key thing is that the learners are showing evidence that they've been discriminating in their choice of sources between better and worse quality in terms of the reliability and validity of the information. AO3 for dissertation is somewhat about the presentation. Is the project well presented in an academic and rigorous way? The choice of language matters. Good academic style is important. That's one of the things we're encouraging them to learn. So a formal, objective, not conversational or casual style would normally be considered appropriate for an academic dissertation. And also, crucially, do they actually develop their own ideas and answer their own question? The dissertation is not just a sort of like an encyclopedia of information. It has to have a central argument, a central thesis. There needs to be something which at the end they can say, this is what I believe I've argued. Their thesis needs to be there. So do they have arguments? Do they develop those arguments? Do they weigh them against counter arguments? And do they do that in a fairly systematic and organized fashion? So those are some of the key elements in AO3. AO4, as I mentioned, is comprised of two parts: the presentation component at the end of the course, where they present the work to an audience, which should at least include their teacher assessor, and then typically there will also be a written evaluation. They can incorporate the evaluation within the presentation, but if they do that, there really needs to be quite detailed evidence that they have evaluated in depth, because as you can see here, we expect at the end of the process that they've really thought in some detail about the extent to which they've met their aims. They've reflected on limitations and problems within the project. They've thought carefully about ways it could be altered, and they've also reflected on lessons learned for the future. A few years ago, I managed to come up with a small acronym, ALAL, Aims, Limitations, Alterations, and Lessons Learned. So that, those are the four dimensions of evaluation which we're looking for, as I say, typically in a written commentary at the end of the project, but that can also be done through the oral presentation. The criteria for the oral presentation speak for themselves. It's about good communication, clear understanding, careful, thoughtful consideration of the audience, having a good structure, and then finally really being able to answer questions. We do actually allow different modes of presentation. If you want to go back to the spec, you'll see that it doesn't have to be the standard 10 minutes with a PowerPoint. They could, for example, pre-record a presentation, or they could present through an exhibition in the school if you're having an events evening or something like that. So there are different modes that can be used, but there does need to be some opportunity for them to respond to questions from their teacher assessor and potentially from others. And that provides a very good quality control check on the whole process, as well as being a valuable skill for them to develop in terms of their confidence to address and respond to questions. Okay, so that's P301. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a run through of 302 because it's quite somewhat similar. And then I can see the questions are building up in the chat thread.
Yeah, I was just going to wonder if it was a good time to talk about the number of sources, because there's quite a few versions of that question, if that's...
That's a good question. Thank you. Yes. I mean, there isn't a hard and fast rule on that. It does depend on the nature of the project. The way to think about it is, if you have a learner who's working over the course of, let's say, 2 terms or something like that, so they've maybe got 25 weeks on their project, it would be a bit disappointing if they haven't found at least one source each week to look at. So a typical bibliography might end up with about a page length of sources. But the reason I say that's not a hard and fast rule is because if they were, for example, doing something about Shakespeare, and they've had to spend much of their project, really working through in detail Shakespeare plus 2 or 3 big hefty commentaries, then obviously we're not going to penalize a learner who's gone into much greater depth on some really challenging sources and doesn't have the same full list of sources at the end in their bibliography. So it's not a hard and fast rule, but probably a good guide would be to look when we get to the exemplars, and you'll soon see the typical length of a bibliography. Page length bibliographies, I think, typically at this level is a reasonable rule of thumb, but it's not a hard and fast rule. Thanks for that, Helen. Have we got any other questions that we need to do now? If not, we'll have a look through it.
The others appear to be being answered. Just one has just pinged in, but I think I can just do that one in the chat. So
okay,
that's okay.
Lovely. Thank you. So let's move on because time is ticking away. So let me take us through now, if I can, our P302 marking grids. So hopefully that's now appeared on screen. Great. So I won't say much about 302 at this point because time is tight. It's comprehensible really in relationship to P301. You'll see that there's a slight difference of emphasis in the AO1 in that we try to look at hypotheses, testable hypotheses as the focus of the project rather than just a research question, although it could be the hypothesis could be framed as a question. Very similar in AO2, but you'll see that there's a real emphasis on data collection. So really substantial data should be collected to inform the investigation. And we expect as well that that data is done in a fairly rigorous way with a methodology, and that there's some analysis of the data, that it's not just sort of information presented on the page, but thought through, connected together and linked to the hypothesis that's being tested. AO3 relates somewhat to AO3 in the dissertation unit, in that we have similar criteria for a good presentation on the page, good quality content communication. But you'll see as well that whilst we want to see argument and counter-argument, we really want that to be focused in on the analysis of data. So looking for trends, looking for patterns, arguing it one way, arguing it another. Is the evidence really consistent, or does it support different hypotheses? Which hypothesis is best supported? And in most cases, that should include some form of probably graphical or numerical presentation. And it's quite common within the investigation unit for that to lead into statistical testing, so that you can actually be quite rigorous in saying what your data show. So if you're shy of numbers, this may not be the unit for you. Review is pretty much identical with a review for P301, perhaps a little bit more emphasis there on methodology, so really critiquing the methodology and the interpretations, really thinking through the extent to which the experiments or the methods that were used were actually valid and reliable in as a basis for the investigation. But otherwise, that's really a run through of the same criteria as 301. Okay. I promised you a break, but I think we'll just complete the review of the criteria. And what I'll do is if we go to 303, I'm going to tee up this slide deck. And then if Helen, if you're happy to just give us a whistle-stop guided tour of 303, that would be lovely. Let me push a few more buttons and see if I can get it on screen.
Oh, I've done it beautifully timed with the dog starting to bark. So,
should we go for the coffee break now? Or you're okay? You're happy to keep going?
If it gets too frantic, I'll hand over to you or Rachel. But no, tell me if it's too annoying. Okay. So I think, as John has said, bearing in mind the assessment objectives are consistent across the 4 units, we're not really looking for a difference in the kind of considerations a learner has at this level. But what they're really doing is they're coming up with that commission, that what they want to do and why they want to do it, and that thinking around purpose, intention, objectives, just as they would for the others. I think one thing maybe to mention that is different is a P303 performance unit can be done as a group project. And if that's the case, an individual role, and I don't just mean in terms of a performance role, but an individual responsibility for the success of the project needs to be taken. And therefore, the evidence needs to have the I as well as the we, as it were, just to make sure that it can be assessed at an individual level. So you want that kind of planning for it to happen and all those key considerations, deadlines, etc., just as you would for the others. And you're looking for a well-organised execution of the work. Thanks, John. And then I think in terms of the research, that kind of information base that's going to inform it and challenge it and let you come up with some kind of original thought, it really is an unhelpful answer when people ask what kind of research, because it's, well, what do they need to find out to be able to do what they want to do? And that might mean it's on the content, the material that's being communicated, especially if it's, for example, a raising awareness of an issue, then you might need some information on that issue so you don't misinform. But it can also be on the form of the project, so the style that's being delivered, the practitioner influences and so on. And it's a perfectly valid source of information to record as part of your wider bibliography if you've got some kind of experiential research. So if you've taken part in a workshop or been to see some performance work to help you inform the choices you're going to make. So really in that broadest sense of what did I use information-wise to inform my creative decisions and my development. Thanks, John. And then when it goes on to the develop and realize, I think the big thing to say here is the performance outcome is the kind of meaty bit of it, but we do want the thinking out loud and the commentary on the process, as this is quite a process-led qualification. But the writing, if you like, of that commentary, the write-up of that commentary of that process doesn't have to be the same kind of formal writing that you'd expect from a dissertation unit. For example, if you're going to direct a piece of performance, the kind of director notebook type commentary where how decisions are made, where they're made, what you're doing, how you're kind of progressing with your work can be done in whatever is fit for purpose for the type of outcome. And then your AO4, your actual AO3 outcome, I should say, should exist and be shared with us as part of that assessment evidence. So if there's a performance that can be videoed, just so we can see the sense of occasion it has and how it manifested in front of an audience, if at all possible, that can be really helpful. And then the AO4 review criteria, pretty much as John has said for the others, that genuine analysis and evaluation and reflection that hopefully is a written evaluation, but also that presentation on their findings. And sometimes a Q&A as part of that presentation can be really helpful at drawing out some of that wider reflection and review. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Helen. That's a lovely and brisk whistle-stop tour that really captures the spirit of the unit here. Lovely. If Rachel, I'm going to press some more buttons and we'll go to 304 to our artifact unit. If you're happy,
I'm ready. Yes,
ready to go when my screen catches up. Let's see if we can pull this in for 304 for artifact. Okay, here we go. With that.
Lovely. So artifact sitting with 303 is going to share much in common with things that Helen has said. We started to address in the earlier talk the form that commission brief might take and how we really do want it to be specific. So to expand, to really think about the user group, the purpose, the genre, the style, materials might be considered, price point might be considered. It's going to be very variable. And I think one overarching thing to say is artifact can cover a huge number of outcomes, and that will inform the type of brief that you create. We do see architecture, we see design, we see art, we see AI projects now, we see literature outcomes, really just about anything, and cookery, as the person put into the chat earlier. So that brief should be fitting for the intended outcome and consider everything you would expect to. Also, it can be a group project. We don't see many, but again, with very specific responsibilities noted on the project proposal form. Planning for all stages and that activity log, just the same as the others. Thank you, John. We can go on to AO2. That's lovely. And you'll see once we get to AO2, this is where we start to see a difference in the language that's used for the artifact unit. You'll see that it's a wide range of different types of possible materials and techniques. So that's very much a lean and a steer towards that primary and experiential type of research is expected for this unit. Sometimes there's a misconception that there should be a literature review. No, we just need a record of the research in the most appropriate form. And as Helen said, just capturing anything that happens. You could have site visits if you're an architect. You might speak with a professional for if you're your artifact is a business plan. It really will be horses for courses, and it's making sure that the record captures that. As we've got techniques in there, skills development is very often a part of AO2 and the research process for P304. And I suppose if we skip to the bottom and that thorough understanding of the complexities of the research, that's really worth getting the individual to consider at the beginning. Is there time in their process and their planning to really delve into the complexities and to gain the skills that they will need to successfully achieve their specific artifacts. All right, John, I think we can go on. And again, the supporting information, structured and clearly, but may well be far more informal, as Helen has stated. We really are looking for it to be captured genuinely. There's no need to try to, fit a more formal or an idea of what do you think the account should look like to it. If the genuine record of the process is a design portfolio, capture that. And in terms of going back to what that looks like, photographs of pages, and then quite often centres successfully upload them into one PowerPoint so we don't get individual bits of evidence. Annotations, so through the different drafts and annotations, so that we really get a coherent narrative of the journey towards the production of the artefact. Clear evidence of the development of ideas. So we will expect to see a multi-stage iteration process. You will expect there to have been testing, prototypes, drafts to have happened. And that will then start to show the refinement we expect to see at the top end. And I suppose just to come to the last one, that we really do bear in mind that this is a level 3 outcome and qualification. And so the resources and skills applied to the artifact would be expected to be commensurate with that. Thank you, John. We can go on. And I should mention for the actual outcome itself, sorry to skip back to AO3, it is really useful to see the artifact in use. So photographs of it being used as intended. If it's an artwork and it was to be displayed in a certain area, let's see that. Let's see an app in use. So recorded evidence is useful for that. Sorry, John, I did think I needed to mention that. And then we come to AO4, it will be the same as been said by others, but very much that process and the outcome, and that they really do go back to that initial brief, come full circle and evaluate against all the different aspects of that first brief. Thank you. Sorry, we can't hear you, John.
Thank you. We're almost perfectly on time, which is extraordinary, but wonderful. So I promised you 5 minutes to put the kettle on, so we're going to do that. We're going to resume at 5 o'clock. So what buttons do you press? Can you step away from this one? No, I think you just mute yourself if you're on mic. That's me, really, isn't it? And switch off the camera. Have a quick drink, and then we'll be back at 5 to look through some exemplar work. Okay, we're going to recommence. Apologies, I've just failed to put a link into the chat thread that I hoped was going to take us to. I'll try once more. I think I've sent it to one of our delegates for today rather than to everybody. Let me just try and send this again. I'm going to just put into the chat thread a link that should take you. I'm not sure if that's actually working. It's curiously adding strange emojis to my post. Just see if that link's worked.
It seems to be. It's just taken me there, I think.
Okay, good. Okay, so that might work. Takes a little bit of navigation. The commentaries and exemplars are at the foot of the page, the teaching and learning materials page. So if that link isn't working for you, then if you just Google search or use your search engine to search up Pearson Project Qualifications Teaching and Learning Materials, that's the headline for the page. And then within that, you should find at the bottom of that page a fresh set of exemplars that we've just literally recently added together with examiner commentaries. So some of those we're going to use in the remaining part of the session. One of the exemplars that we're going to refer to isn't on there, but we hope it will be added. So without further ado, because time is tight, we're not going to spend long, I'm afraid, deliberating over the marks, but essentially what I'd like to do is just highlight a few key features of what exemplar work within the different units might look like, and then how that would correspond to marks awarded. So without further ado, we're going to begin with P301. Let me bring on screen a 301 exemplar, which is available on the on that link that I mentioned.
We've put the link in actually, John, which is without the emojis. So there is a new version of the link just appeared as well in chat.
That's great. Thank you very much. I'm not sure where they appeared from. I'm not normally prone to emojis. So on screen now, I hope you should see a project. We'll just jump through the forms at the start with the title, "What is the role of capitalism in resolving climate change?" Is that visible on screen?
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
Great, splendid. This is in the new exemplar folder on the website, so I'm not going to spend a long time on it. I mean, it's 45 pages, but I just want you to get a feel for the kind of work that we've got here, and then I'll bring in my commentary where I just highlight a few key features. So without, as I say, spending a long time on this, you'll see that first of all we have a question. Okay, it's not just a topic at the headline of the project. We've actually framed a good, quite challenging but quite specific question. So we're going to explore this interesting question about capitalism and climate change. You'll see as well that it's a substantially developed proposal form. Possibly, if we were being critical, there might be scope for a little bit more development of certain parts of this. I mean, it's quite a short account there of the reasons for choosing the project, given the amount that would be available on this topic. We've got some planning, and we've also got some supplementary planning documents, not necessary, but interesting that that's been done. And again, without going through it in detail, a reasonably well-developed activity log showing a journey of discovery, a journey of ideas, mentors, recording points discussed with a mentor, so that's helpful to know. That's possibly a project of this level, as I'm sure you appreciate already, this is a strong project, possibly a little on the short side, but a reasonably reflective document. Nicely structured. This candidate has followed a very standard, it's not mandatory, but it's a very standard format for an academic dissertation with an abstract, an introduction, a literature review, a discussion, and a conclusion. I won't, as I say, go through it in detail, but you'll see it's formally well put on the page, well structured, lots of use of subheadings. As we get into the work, you'll begin to see that it's well referenced, really very well referenced. And if we look at those references, you can see this is a candidate who has dug into the literature. This is not just simple things coming off the top of a web search. There's some proper scholarly sources being consulted. Use of data, and all of that's well cited and well referenced. Good structure to the literature review with subheadings, a thematic organization, really, really nicely created and comprehensive as well. So this is really very impressive bit of research. As I say, we don't have time to jump through everything, so let me take you then to the discussion. The discussion really goes in some depth into the arguments, and you'll see here as well a couple of key features. First of all, this is not just a candidate who's giving their own opinion. They're actually backing up points at all points in the argument with evidence from sources, critique of scholars, bringing in their perspectives, really quite detailed, quite technically rigorous. Possibly, if we were going to be a little critical, perhaps a little bit wide-ranging, and sometimes that can happen with a project when the title allows a broad range of ideas to be discussed. It can make it difficult to keep track of the threads of argument in the discussion. A key word here that I always look for, however. This is a candidate who's actually considered counter-arguments. It's not just a one-sided dissertation. There's a balance of argument and counter-argument. There you are, you can see it again. However, the more howevers there are, I think the better the quality in terms of the dialectical structure of the discussion, because this is someone who's constantly critiquing and constantly arguing. So I won't go through all the details, but you can see good range of sources applied into the discussion, lots of argument, lots of counter argument, possibly, if we're being critical, a little bit wide-ranging, but a very impressive piece of work with a solid, well-developed conclusion, and then a quite detailed written evaluation. Somebody was asking earlier about the bibliography, so here we've got, what have we got? I don't know, 25, 30 sources, perhaps slightly more. Impressive range of sources, and slides as well, which just provide a little bit more evidence for AO4. So that you won't be surprised to know did very well. I'm not sure if it was sitting around about the AA star boundary in the awarding series when it was submitted. It's not a completely contemporaneous piece. Let me just bring on the commentary.
John, there's just one question that might be timely, if you don't mind, which is somebody asking, can the discussion be included in the main body?
Yes, that's a great question. Yeah, this structure of separating out literature review and discussion is not mandatory. It works for many projects, but there are other projects where it makes more sense to integrate. And a simple structure, of course, is to have chapters. What does matter is that the writing is not just a kind of presentation of information. There does need to be focused critique and analysis and argument and a central thesis which is defended throughout the work. So if a student is going to integrate research with discussion within a chapter structure, it makes sense to encourage them to really keep a tight hold on the thread of argument throughout the work. But yes, there's nothing mandatory about separating literature review and discussion. It just is a helpful structure because, of course, it basically corresponds to AO2 and then AO3, and it means that if you have that as a starting point, then you're encouraging your learners to make sure they've done some AO2 research and that they've done some AO3 discussion and debate and argument. But in some cases, it can be artificial, and then in those cases, choose a different framework. So briefly then, you can see this scored not quite full marks, but it was not far off the top of the mark range. A strong in all areas. As I mentioned, possibly scope for a little bit more development of the proposal form and the activity log. But then with research, very little that wasn't present. It was a very strong piece, possibly scope for a little bit more evaluation and critique of the source reliability, but otherwise exemplary in terms of the range and depth of research. Argument and counter-argument, as I said, using data from sources, possibly a little bit wide-ranging, perhaps, if we're being very critical, but really very strong indeed, and virtually full marks in AO3. And AO4 was supported by the presentation, evidence, and the written evaluation. Key features there being that the candidate was quite honest and quite perceptive about their work. They didn't hide. It's encouraging when candidates don't hide the gaps and the weaknesses and the things that could have gone better. Okay, I'm conscious of time rolling by. So with that in mind, let me rather briskly introduce you to a P302 exemplar, an exemplar investigation. And I am afraid I am going to just sketch this one out because I want Helen and Rachel to have time to share with us some performance and artifact work before we complete in about 15 minutes time. So
just as you're getting that up quickly, would you just like to give your wisdom on whether Harvard referencing is preferred or footnotes are an expectation, which would just...
There's no, yeah, thanks, that's a good question. There is no preferred method of referencing. It needs to be appropriate and consistent. So a minimal standard would be that there should be a web link with the date of access. Obviously that would be a little bit basic, but that would be a minimal standard. Beyond that, if they've chosen a consistent method, whether that's Harvard, MLA, APA, footnotes, endnotes, really that's your discretion, but it needs to be consistent through the project, and the minimum standard is that you can then retrieve the information. I find it nowadays, that aspect is there's so many useful tools, digital tools, bibliography builders, tools built into word processors that do all this automatically, and so educating learners to use the most easy one of those is probably the way to go. As time is tight, I'm not going to really comment much on this at all, but just draw your attention to what it looks like really as an investigation piece. It was a project where the learner was interested in plant development. They've included the mark grids, which we don't really need, but I think they'd use those for annotation purposes. So the question was, how does temperature affect plant growth and development? Possibly a bit broad in focus, but at least we have a hypothesis or a question that could lead to a testable hypothesis. Quite a detailed proposal form there. Log, again, as with the previous project, could perhaps have been made a little bit more of. I think there's about a dozen entries or so for the whole project. So that's really a little bit on the short side relative to what would be an 80-hour project that typically might occupy several months at least. We've got some evidence of the oral presentation, and then we've got a nicely structured written report. I won't go into it in depth. You'll see that, again, they followed a model with an abstract, an introduction, a literature review, which is basically just accounting for information about their topic. There's some discussion of methodology coming up. How do we study plant development? This was involving imagery, use of imaging techniques, optical fluorescence and such like. A methodology for growing the samples. This was work that was done, I think, under some supervision. It's not normal for learners to be let loose in the laboratory on their own. We have some consideration of ethics, which is always good to see when we're growing things that could have consequences. We have some data. Nice to see some data, some graphs. We like to see graphs, P302. Not huge amounts of it, 2 or 3 bar charts, but there's a little bit of nice statistical analysis with some p-values. I think a t-test has been done. Not huge, but nicely done. An appendix, and in this case, a rather basic but moderate length bibliography, which has listed the sources. So that one was, compare that on feel factor. It's not a piece of work at the same level as the dissertation that we were just examining, and this was scored by the centre and supported at moderation as being essentially a mid-range piece. So I think the mark here was sort of mid-grade range, C grade range, probably thereabouts. A scope for more development of the activity records, quite a good range. So top of mark band 2, quite a good range of sources, some data collection, some analysis, scope for that to have been a little bit more in depth. And similarly with the exploration in AO3, scope for a little bit more development of that, but a reasonable attempt at understanding. The kind of thing that would have elevated this piece would have been perhaps a follow-up experiment where the hypothesis had been tested and had led to further ideas which could then be further investigated. This was essentially a rather slightly more self-contained experiment. And I think the moderation again supported the AO4 mark. Okay, so we have only 15 minutes, 14 minutes still to go, but we're going to try and get through. I think, Helena, I'm sorry about this. I think given the time and also given the limits of technology, we might have to refer people to the website to play the music.
Absolutely, yeah. I think
is
that's
that okay?
Fine. I mean, we could kind of give just even, if you like, a pen picture of the project, if that's
that would be absolutely lovely. Yes. Let me bring it on screen. So we're now moving to performance, unit P303, 92 pages of report, and there's also an exemplar, there was also a music composition, which you can access through the link on the website. I think the project is called Lockdown Music or something like that. Is that right?
It is, yeah. Lockdown Suite is the title of the project. Yeah. So I can just very briefly talk through, and maybe John scrolls at the same time to give you a whistle-stop tour. So this was a full mark, excellent, absolutely excellent music project. The learner gave the work the title of Lockdown Suite. They did ask a question, which was, can music be used to evoke a shared collective and individual experiences related to lockdown? But it could have been, they set themselves a commission, it could have simply been compose music that can, and kind of do it that way. So there's choices at that point on a performance project. As you will see scrolling through here, the project proposal form, really clear, very focused objectives, which actually mean they can stay on track and check themselves as they create their work, that they don't go off on a wild card. One of the strengths and one of the reasons why it can do so well is that the learner has full ownership of the ideas. And I think it's far easier to excel when you're passionate and owning and motivated by what you're trying to create than when you've been told what to feel creative about. There's also scope for a genuine phase of exploration. So a lot of this activity log that John's scrolling through will be talking about, as John was saying earlier, not just today I did this, yesterday the door was locked, I couldn't get in, so-and-so was off, I couldn't do this. It'll actually be about the ideas, the thinking that's informing that activity. So full ownership of the ideas is an absolute key strength, but then it's coupled, which you don't always see, with very good organisational ability, which is consistently evident in this project. You'll see there are footnotes, and that leads me on to say, as this discussion and this commentary on the process is taking place, it doesn't have to be presented as formally as this is. However, it doesn't mean it can't be if that's how a learner wants to present it. But fundamentally, the strength of it is the research phase is so robust, and that the information findings from the good range of sources and appropriate and relevant sources has been that they can use the information to influence their creation of original work. So good strength is the influences for practitioners, really does support a conscious selection of their creative intentions, as well as the techniques and approaches for actually making performance repertoire. The performance outcome is fully realised. It's technically probably beyond the level of proficiency we would have to see to award a full marks. They've clearly got a very sophisticated language of music. I think this does come back to one of those earlier questions we had, which is, can you use a subject you're already learning? Clearly this student is a music scholar, somebody who's studied music for a considerable amount of time, but this project is genuinely an extension of their musical knowledge and understanding. It's not just their A-level music coursework. It's clearly a very original and unique piece of work. Key creative choices are linked to the effect on the listener, the audience, fully realised in the performance outcome. It is worth a listen. It's even worth a listen on your drive home or whatever you're doing this evening. The written support materials, really thorough, really detailed, and have an analytical approach. You know why they did something, not just what they did, and you know how they used the information they had practically in developing the work. And there's a real effective ongoing reflection and an intelligent evaluation that they want to know what they did that was well. There's an interest in their own development process, which leads to an excellent evaluation as well. So it got full marks. There's probably not a lot more to say about it. It's not a birdhouse. This is the next one. John's lining up.
Sorry.
But I'm sure you can listen to it whilst you're feeding the birds. So, yeah.
I'm rushing us through. That was fantastic. Thank you, Helen. You really captured that within about 3 minutes. This is terrific. Thank you. Yes, sorry, I'm pressing my buttons in anticipation. We're moving from music to the birds. Who does that remind me of? There must be a composer who did that. Bird, maybe. Let's. Sorry, everybody. I'm fully aware we are just. It's the appetizer, really, not rather than the main course. But we are going to help you to have a taste for each of the units before you go. So, do you want to talk us through bird housing, Rachel?
I can do a whistle-stop tour of the bird housing, certainly. And I think this one is here. It's another mid-range mark. And just to reassure you that if you go to the Unit 4 file on the website, there are lots of top band marks. So this will complement those well when it goes up. And it's a good example of how to present a DT style project. It's one way that you could do it. As we go through and you look and you start to see plenty of evidence of planning that comes in lots of different ways and not just on that activity log and project proposal form. So we can look holistically and credit what's there. This activity log actually boosted the marks really because it is really reflective, and what's lovely is it is a live planning document. It's not been kind of added to retrospectively. It genuinely looks forward and is that thinking out loud of what do I need to do next. As we scroll on down, there was good planning, but perhaps tempered with some shortcomings in the time management. As we go through, you see the additional, there's a Gantt chart, which has actually been used. Sometimes you see the first version, but you don't see what happened and how it was used. More planning document, and then the design brief, which could perhaps be slightly more focused, which is why this isn't right at the very top of the range. And where this sits, and there's a slight disconnect in this project throughout the way through, it beautifully, the evidence completely matches what we want from the 4 different outcomes, but the learner perhaps just doesn't quite manage to realise their first brief fully, and so doesn't quite get there. You see pictorial evidence. We're starting to see a comparison of different possible versions of a birdhouse. There's primary research, and again sitting in band 2 rather than the top band, clearly presented as everything is, but maybe just not the reflection on the outcomes of it and even the size of sample. We start to look into different areas, and you can see referencing. One thing I would put a shout out for is some encouragement to ensure that images and information perhaps is clearly cited when they're used. We do get as far as seeing artifacts that use other people's images and don't credit them. As we go through ongoing planning, developing planning ideas, and we start to see so much time has been spent on the planning and the research that maybe we've not got such detail on that development. And we do remember that that is the big weighty part. And when you go through this and look at it, you'll see perhaps that we've got clear rather than thorough understanding, and a band 2 annotation and understanding of what it is that they're trying to do, or indeed why they've selected ideas to go forward. Nevertheless, we get a strong sense of an iterative process, many stages. As you can see, there's modelling, there's CAD modelling before we make a selection and go on to the final wooden artefact itself, with some consideration of materials that could perhaps be more further developed alongside the processes. So as you can see, we've got images of the tools, selection, what we really need to see, and then we come on to the presentation. And what you just see coming up now is that analysis against all aspects of the specification and a review which does give an honest appraisal and is quite strong on what next, how to improve. And I think that's a strength within the evaluation that we see in this piece. Thank you. Can't hear you again, John.
Thank you so much. That's tremendous. Thank you. We've flown through that one, and it's bringing us towards the end. We're very grateful to you for staying with us. We're conscious we've given you a huge amount within a relatively compressed space of time. There was one question I noticed just scrolling through the chat thread that we hadn't picked up, which was to do with sample size. I don't know whether that related to any particular unit. P302 often involves samples. Again, no hard and fast rule, because if you're doing in-depth quantitative research, which is going to be technically quite demanding, you may not also be able to do processing of a huge number. But a typical sample of, say, 50 responses for a questionnaire might be a reasonable sample size, if that was appropriate for the type of project. If it's fewer than that at the level 3 project, you might begin to think, well, have we got any meaningful data? So that was just to address one question. Are there any other questions that have come in that we should pick up?
We got to the others, or we direct message some people back on some.
Lovely. Okay, that's great. In which case, just as we start to draw to a close, if I press the buttons and find the right presentation, I would like to just bring us towards a close by highlighting a few final points and some resources that are available to you. For teaching purposes, we have a bunch of support resources for you. There's obviously the specification, there's schemes of work, a teacher guide. We've recorded during the lockdown, we've recorded a bunch of webinars, some of which are teacher facing, some of which are learner facing, freely available on the Future Ready microsite, which will give your mentors support and also your students guidance. Helen and Rachel appear, and I've recorded some of the mentor guidance, and we worked with a partner organization to produce detailed guidance for learners, free webinars, excellent content, very helpful. Breaking news, we have new pathways to give you a thematic or organized approach to your project qualification if you're wanting to address artificial intelligence, topic of the moment. This is encouraging a critical and reflective look at how AI can be used as a tool and as a resource, but encouraging the learner always to take charge of the process and to critique the responses that come from AI. And obviously it has to be their own work with appropriate referencing when AI has been used as a tool or resource. We also have a climate change and sustainability pathway, and that's worth a look for partner organisation IEMA that we've worked with on that. The Future Skills Pathway has been present for a year or two now, and there's content there to link EPQ to employability. These links, I won't go through them all, but this will take you to further guidance on the moderation and assessment process, and also summary sheets which help you to understand the criteria in a fairly condensed form, and that will be useful to you as you get towards the end of the process and you're deliberating about marks.
John, apologies for interrupting you, but I think maybe the slide we're seeing isn't maybe the same side as the one you're looking at. It's a little bit confusing about which website. So I'm assuming it's via the Pearson website. Rachel's just popped the link in. Thank you. It's the Future.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Sorry about that.
That's right.
Let me just see if I can just work on another
on a good
slide.
roll, so we didn't want to interrupt. But
yeah,
the link is in the chat now. But
the link's in the chat. That's perfect. Well, thank you for that. That is really just drawing us towards a close. So it only remains for me to say thank you very much to Helen and Rachel. Thank you to you all for your attendance this afternoon. I hope you found it informative, and do look out for future events and all the resources that exist, which are going to be subject to ongoing update in the coming weeks and months ahead. So thank you very much for your time with us, and all the best with your EPQ journeys going forwards.